Political ideas, things like authority or loyalty, even resistance, they feel so current, like they just popped up on social media yesterday.
Right, but they're absolutely fundamental. They go way back.
Exactly. Why do we feel we should follow laws? And, maybe more importantly, who gets to make them in the first place?
And that's really the heart of political philosophy. It's that branch of thinking that steps back from just describing what's happening politically and starts asking why it should happen that way. How does it connect to big ideas like justice or citizenship or legitimacy?
Okay, so consider this deep dive your shortcut maybe to understanding those foundational blueprints for how we govern ourselves. We're going to pull ideas from centuries of debate.
From ancient philosophers dreaming up perfect cities, all the way to modern arguments about economic fairness, which are still very much alive.
Yeah, and our mission here is to kind of compare those older concepts, those ideal societies, with the actual structures and, let's face it, the problems we deal with right now. All right, so let's get into it. If we really want to grasp the modern state, I think we have to start where this whole debate arguably kicked off. Ancient Greece.
Definitely. The polis, the city-state, that was the basic unit. And the early questions really revolved around virtue. What makes a political community good?
And Aristotle offers a classic starting point there.
He does. He basically argues that for a person to live a truly good life, a flourishing life, they need to live virtuously. And he uses this concept of telos.
Telos. Okay, that sounds a bit academic. How should we think about that practically?
Well, think of telos as like the inherent purpose of something. A seed's telos is to become a tree, right? A knife's telos is to cut effectively.
Gotcha.
For humans, Aristotle thought our telos, our purpose, involves rational activity and acting virtuously. So living in a well-designed political society isn't just like a nice add-on for him, it's essential.
Why essential?
Because he believed it's the only place we can really develop the habits of right action that make us virtuous.
Okay, so the people making the laws aren't just rule makers, they're kind of moral trainers in Aristotle's view.
In a sense, yes.
That maybe sounds a little controlling to our ears today. But Plato, he takes that idea way further in the Republic, doesn't he?
Yeah.
With his blueprint for the just city.
Oh, absolutely. Plato designs this whole society structured purely on mutual need and people's natural aptitudes. Farmers farm, weavers weave, and so on. But the absolute key to his system is the leadership class. The guardians.
The guardians,
Yeah.
right. They start as soldiers, and the best of them eventually become the rulers, the famous philosopher kings.
Exactly. And their lives are, well, famously strict. Ascetic, really.
They live communally, right? No private property.
Correct. Rigorous training from childhood, focusing on character, courage, honor, and yes, communal living, holding children and property in common.
Why go that far?
The idea is to completely eliminate self-interest. If you can't build personal wealth, if you can't favor your own kids, then the main temptations for corruption are theoretically gone. And the whole state is built on 4 key virtues: wisdom for the rulers, courage for the soldiers, discipline throughout, and then justice, which is basically the harmony of all those parts working together correctly.
It's pretty amazing how this focus on the ruler's moral character pops up elsewhere, too, not just in Greece.
It really is. If you look globally, you see similar patterns. Take Mohism in ancient China during the chaotic warring states period.
What was their take?
Well, the Mohists saw the root of all the disorder as, and this is a quote, everybody having his own idea. People just lacked shared moral standards.
Okay, so chaos reigns because there's no common ground.
So their solution: heaven chooses a benevolent ruler whose job is to unify everyone's will and provide that missing moral education. It's a very top-down approach to virtue.
Interesting. A divine mandate, almost.
In a way, yeah. And then fast forward centuries later to the early Islamic world, look at Al-Farabi. He's sometimes called the second master, right after Aristotle, and he explicitly bases his ideal city of excellence on Plato's model.
So, another virtuous ruler.
Yes, but with a twist. His supreme ruler needed both practical skills, statecraft, and deep theoretical knowledge, philosophy. And the goal wasn't just order or even things like wealth or power, what he called presumed happiness. The real goal was true happiness, which only comes from virtuous actions.
It's genuinely fascinating how these thinkers, oceans and centuries apart, land on the idea that the virtue of the ruler is the absolute cornerstone of a good system.
It is, but we absolutely have to pause here and acknowledge a huge issue with this ancient focus. The profound tradition of exclusion. These ideal systems were almost universally designed by men for a very specific, narrow group of men.
Right. Women, enslaved people, often foreigners, sometimes the poor. They were generally shut out of citizenship, let alone governance.
Absolutely. Aristotle himself explicitly said women have a capacity for deliberation, but that it lacks authority within the polis. It's baked right into the foundation.
And that structural exclusion really points to a weakness, doesn't it? If your whole system relies on a tiny, virtuous elite.
And it forces us to ask, if living in this political society is supposedly necessary for human flourishing, what about the flourishing of everyone who's deliberately kept out of power?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. And it leads us neatly into the next major shift in political thought, which is all about legitimacy.
Right. Where does the right to rule actually come from? If it's not automatically from the gods or inherent virtue, then what?
And this is where things get really interesting, I think, with the social contract theorists.
Definitely. Because they basically flip the script. Legitimacy stops coming down from heaven and starts coming up from the governed, from the people themselves.
But crucially, the big names here had wildly different ideas about why people would agree to this contract in the first place.
Oh, completely different. You see the clash most clearly between Thomas Hobbes and John Locke.
Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, he had a pretty bleak view of life before government, right? The state of nature.
Bleak is an understatement. For Hobbes, it was pure terror, constant fear, a war of all against all.
That famous line, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. So if that's the reality you're trying to escape,
then your top priority isn't freedom, it's just staying alive.
Precisely. Which is why Hobbes argues you have to surrender basically all your rights to one absolute central authority, his Leviathan, just to guarantee peace and order. Survival trumps everything.
Okay, so order at almost any cost. But Locke sees it very differently.
Totally differently. Locke's state of nature isn't terrifying chaos. It's mostly peaceful, actually, governed by natural law, by reason, which he believed God gave us.
So if it's mostly peaceful, why form a government at all?
For Locke, it's more about inconvenience, specifically the difficulty of protecting your property reliably when everyone is their own judge and enforcer.
Ah, so property is key for Locke. And by property, he means more than just land, right?
Yes, crucially, he includes our lives, our liberties, and our possessions. So the social contract, for Locke, is formed primarily to protect these fundamental rights.
And that's a massive difference from Hobbes. If the state's main job is protecting rights, not just ensuring survival,
then the people retain the right to overthrow a government that violates those rights. If the government breaks the contract, becomes tyrannical, the people can dissolve it and start over.
a concept that obviously had huge implications down the line, especially for democratic revolutions.
Immense influence, yes.
Okay, so that's the philosophical grounding of legitimacy. But how does authority actually get accepted in the real world? Max Weber, the sociologist, had some ideas on this.
Right, Weber wasn't so much focused on what should be legitimate, but on describing how authority is practically accepted by people. He identified three main types.
What's the first?
First is traditional legitimacy. This is based purely on long-standing custom and practice. Think of an inherited monarchy. They rule because their family has always ruled. It's just the way things are done.
Okay, makes sense. Based on history.
Second, he identified charismatic legitimacy. This isn't based on tradition or rules, but on the extraordinary personal appeal of a specific leader.
Like a revolutionary figure, maybe. Someone people are drawn to.
Exactly. Weber might point to someone like, say, Nelson Mandela. Before he became president, his influence stemmed from his personal charisma and moral authority. But Weber also saw this as the most unstable type.
Why unstable?
Because it's entirely tied to that one individual. If they lose appeal or die, the legitimacy can just evaporate.
Right. Okay, so traditional, charismatic. What's the third?
The third, and the one Weber thought was the most stable and characteristic of modern states, is rational legal legitimacy. Here, authority comes from belief in the legality of the system itself. The Constitution, the laws, the procedures, the office. It doesn't matter so much who holds the office. The authority rests in the structure.
So that's the foundation for modern democracies, bureaucracies.
Precisely. People obey the president or the prime minister or the tax code, not because of ancient tradition or personal magnetism, but because they accept the legitimacy of the legal order that put them there.
And these different bases of legitimacy lead to the kinds of organized systems we see around the world.
Exactly. You get systems like monarchy, which can be absolute or constitutional. You get aristocracy, ruled by a select elite.
Which can sometimes manifest in really rigid social hierarchies, like the traditional Indian caste system, the Hadi.
Right. And then you have representative government.
Ruled by elected officials.
Uh-huh.
And there are arguments that this system is just better at producing good outcomes, right?
Yeah, that's the instrumental defense. Thinkers like Amartya Sen famously argued that democracies are less likely to fight each other, and crucially, that no major famine has ever occurred in an independent democratic country. The accountability matters.
But then, sort of lurking as the dark opposite of that representative freedom, is totalitarianism.
A profoundly different beast. Totalitarianism isn't just authoritarian, it seeks total control over everything. Public life, private life, using censorship, pervasive surveillance.
We often think of regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union or Mussolini's Italy.
Those are key examples. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who studied these regimes intensely, argued their ultimate terrifying goal wasn't just power, but the complete eradication of any notion of the self as an individual.
Eradicating the individual, how?
Through systematic violence and terror, the goal is to atomize society, break all bonds of trust, and make people incapable of independent thought or action, turning them into mere extensions of the state's will. It's about creating total fear.
Chilling. Okay, so we've talked about who should rule, why they rule, and how they rule. Let's shift to a question that dominates modern politics. Who gets what? Fairness.
Right. And that brings us to distributive justice. It's the whole moral framework for thinking about how we fairly allocate wealth, opportunities, goods, services, all the stuff societies produce and distribute.
And the giant in this field, in modern times at least, is John Rawls.
Rawls proposed this incredibly influential thought experiment, the veil of ignorance.
Explain that. What's the idea?
Okay, imagine you're in what he calls the original position. You're about to design the basic structure of society. But, and this is the key, you're behind a veil of ignorance, meaning you have no idea who you will be in that society. You don't know your race, your class, your talents, your wealth, your gender, your health, nothing about your specific circumstances.
Wow. That's a powerful idea. Because you have to design a system that's fair even for the people at the very bottom.
Exactly. Because you might end up being one of them. It forces impartiality.
So what kind of principles does Rawls think we'd choose from behind this veil?
He argues we'd agree on two main principles. First, everyone gets an equal right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberties for others. Freedom of speech, conscience, that sort of thing.
Okay, equal basic rights. What's the second?
The second is often called the difference principle. It says that any social and economic inequalities, differences in wealth or authority are only justified if they work out to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society.
So inequality isn't necessarily forbidden, but it has to demonstrably help those at the bottom.
Precisely. It's not about forcing equal outcomes for everyone, but about ensuring the system doesn't unfairly disadvantage people due to factors beyond their control, and that any advantages for some also lift up the worst off.
That's a compelling framework for fairness. But of course, not everyone agrees that fairness is even possible within certain economic systems.
Right. And the most powerful critique here historically comes from Karl Marx. His focus wasn't so much on distribution within the system, but on the nature of the system itself, specifically capitalism.
And his key concept there is alienation.
Yes. Marx argued that under capitalism, the worker's labor becomes just another commodity to be bought and sold, often for just enough to survive a subsistence wage.
How does that lead to alienation?
Well, he argued it estranges workers in several ways. They're alienated from the product they create. They don't own it, often don't even see the final version. They're alienated from the actual act of working. It's often repetitive, meaningless, forced. They become alienated from their own human nature, their potential, and even alienated from each other, forced into competition.
And the profit, the surplus value created by their labor,
is claimed by the capitalist, the owner of the means of production. Marx saw this as inherently exploitative and unjust.
Okay, so Rawls focusing on fairness within the structure, Marx critiquing the structure itself. This brings us to the kind of broad ideological camps that shape these debates today. Maybe we can touch on a few key ones quickly.
Sure. We could start with conservatism. Generally speaking, conservatism emphasizes respect for established institutions, traditions, and favors gradual change over radical shifts.
And often a belief that human nature has limits, maybe is fundamentally flawed, so order and self-discipline are crucial.
That's often a core tenet, yes, along with strong support for property rights and established social hierarchies.
Then you have liberalism in the philosophical sense.
Right, not necessarily tied to a specific party, but the philosophy. Its core idea, stemming from thinkers like John Stuart Mill, is about maximizing individual liberty.
By limiting government.
Primarily, yes. especially focusing on what's called negative liberty, freedom from interference. Mill's famous harm principle is key here. The only justifiable reason to restrict someone's freedom is to prevent harm to others.
Okay, so conservatism valuing order and tradition, liberalism valuing individual liberty. What about the edge cases, like anarchism?
Literally means no ruler. Anarchists take the liberty argument to its extreme. They tend to believe that government itself is the source of disorder, not human nature.
So they think people are naturally cooperative and rational.
Often, yes. That it's the state, with its hierarchies and coercion, that creates conflict. Some anarchist thinkers, like Emma Goldman, even viewed acts of political violence not as senseless mayhem, but as a kind of inevitable violent recoil, as she put it, against the violence of an oppressive state.
Quite a spectrum of ideas. Wow, we've really covered a lot of ground here, from Plato's philosopher kings and their communal city.
All the way through the massive shift with social contract, thinking about where legitimacy comes from.
And landing right in the middle of today's intense debates about economic justice, fairness, and even the dangers of total state control.
And we've seen how that idea of legitimacy, that contract between the people and the state, is central. But it raises a final, really challenging question.
Which is?
Well, if legitimacy rests on a contract, what happens when the state clearly violates its end of the deal, when it becomes fundamentally unjust?
That really puts the focus back on the individual's conscience, doesn't it? I'm thinking of someone like Mahatma Gandhi.
Exactly. Gandhi, fighting against British colonial rule, developed his principles of ahimsa, non-harming, and satyagraha, holding firmly to truth.
And he famously argued that civil disobedience, refusing to obey unjust laws, wasn't just an option, but
a sacred duty when the state has become lawless or corrupt. His ultimate loyalty was to his moral code, to truth and non-harm. And he believed that superseded the obligation to obey a state acting unjustly.
So that leaves us with a powerful question to consider, doesn't it? If you feel your primary duty is to a moral code, maybe one that forbids causing harm or demands speaking truth, does that duty ever override your obligation as a citizen to obey the laws of your state, even flawed one?
Where does that line fall for you? What stands out when you weigh the duty of a citizen against perhaps a deeper duty to your own sense of truth or morality? It's something political philosophy constantly asks us to grapple with.